Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 14 minutes before a Navy admiral's heart stopped beating. The fluorescent lights of Seattle General hummed their mechanical lullaby across the night shift, casting pale shadows that made everyone look slightly dead before they actually were. Sarah Chen moved through the third-floor corridors with the practiced invisibility of someone trained to disappear into walls, her white shoes making no sound against the linoleum despite the worn tread. Muscle memory. 12 years of learning how to take up the smallest amount of space, how to be present without being seen, how to move through hostile territory, whether that territory was a convoy route through Helmand Province or a hospital hallway where the real danger wore Italian shoes and a Rolex. The suture in her hands was delicate work. A laceration on a 58-year-old accountant who'd walked into a glass door at home. Drunk. Ashamed. The kind of wound that required precision, not speed. Sarah's hands moved with the fluid certainty of someone who had closed far worse things in far worse light, her fingers threading the 4.0 nylon through tissue with movements so economical they looked almost meditative. In and out. In and out. The rhythm never changed, whether you were closing a surgical site in a sterile operating room or holding a Marine's abdomen together with field dressings while rounds snapped overhead. The accountant watched her work, mesmerized. "You're really good at that," he said, wine-slurred and grateful. Sarah didn't look up. "Experience," she said quietly, and that was all. The word sat between them like a stone. She'd learned long ago that the fewer words people heard from her, the fewer assumptions they made. No accent gave them nothing to latch onto. No elaboration meant no questions. No questions meant no answers that could be checked against databases that were supposed to have her listed as deceased. The surgical floor at 2:36 a.m. smelled like antiseptic, floor wax, and the particular brand of exhaustion that came from people doing difficult work in fluorescent light. Sarah moved through the nurse's station with her completed charts, each note written in precise, economical handwriting, no wasted letters, no flourishes, the way military personnel were trained to write reports that could survive scrutiny. She had finished charting the laceration closure when Dr. Marcus Whitfield arrived. He always arrived. Even on night shift, even when he wasn't scheduled, even when his presence served no medical purpose. He arrived because the surgical floor was his kingdom, and kingdoms required inspection. He was tall, silver-haired in the way that expensive hair color could achieve, with custom Italian shoes that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. His cologne preceded him by several seconds, something with leather notes and the unmistakable tang of old money. He moved through the corridor like a man who had never once questioned his right to occupy space, and Sarah watched him from her peripheral vision while pretending to organize discharge paperwork. Whitfield's eyes found her immediately. They always did. She represented something that unsettled him, a quiet competence that didn't require validation, a composure that his constant maneuvering couldn't penetrate. She was a threat not because she wanted his job, but because she seemed completely indifferent to whether he had it or not. The staff lounge erupted in laughter an hour later, the kind of laughter that echoed differently when someone important was laughing first. Sarah had stepped in to grab her 10-minute break, the coffee in the machine tasting like it had been brewed sometime during the Clinton administration. She was already turning to leave when Whitfield's voice cut through the noise, deliberate and projecting, a voice meant to be heard. 14 days, he announced, setting down her espresso cup with theatrical precision. That's my estimate. 2 weeks before the new recruit quits. He looked directly at Sarah, not bothering with subtlety. They always do. Can't handle the pace. Can't handle working under someone with actual standards. The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when a predator has marked prey. Sarah's jaw tightened, just barely, just enough that someone with training would notice the momentary tension in her masseter muscle. She didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge. She simply continued moving toward the door, her movements deliberate and calm, the way you move when you're conscious of every eye in the space and committed to giving them nothing. Unless you think you'll last longer. Whitfield called after her, his tone bright with the confidence of someone who had never been genuinely challenged in his life. I'm happy to raise the stakes. A bet, perhaps? Professional wager between colleagues. Sarah's hand paused on the doorframe for exactly 1 beat. Then she stepped through into the corridor, the door swinging closed behind her with a soft hydraulic hiss. She didn't hear his response because she wasn't there to witness it, and that, more than any cutting remark she could have delivered, seemed to infuriate him in a way that made the silence behind her feel like a small, perfect victory. But that wasn't the worst part. The cafeteria at 4:33 a.m. was nearly empty, just Sarah and a skeleton crew of night shift workers moving through the motions of maintaining a hospital that never truly slept. She had assembled her usual meal, turkey sandwich, black coffee, and apple she would probably not eat. The tray was ceramic, hospital standard, and her hands were steady as she moved through the serving line. Steady hands were everything in nursing. Steady hands were the difference between comfort and catastrophe, between precision and error. Steady hands were what had kept her alive for 12 years. Whitfield appeared at 4:41 a.m., and Sarah felt him before she saw him. There was a quality to his presence, a displacement of air that came with expensive cologne and the kind of aggression that didn't announce itself loudly. He was moving through the cafeteria with theatrical casualness, and Sarah's training recognized the setup immediately, the way his trajectory angled toward her, the way his timing was too convenient, the way his posture carried intent masked as accident. She was reaching for her water glass when his elbow connected with her tray. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate and perfectly calibrated to maximize damage and deniability, a collision that would look accidental to anyone reviewing security footage, but which carried intention in every vector. The tray toppled. Turkey sandwich scattered across the institutional tile floor. Coffee splashed across the white linoleum in a dark spreading stain. Papers, scattered charts she'd been reviewing during her break, scattered like wounded birds across the kitchen floor, their edges darkening as they absorbed coffee. The room went absolutely silent. Whitfield stood motionless for a moment, his expression arranged into perfect surprise, as if his own arm had betrayed him. "Oh my God," he said, his tone carrying just enough concern to seem credible. "I am so sorry. That was completely clumsy of me." He looked around at the handful of night shift workers watching, then back at Sarah. "Here, I'll help you pick that up." But his posture didn't move toward helping. His hands remained at his sides. He was standing over her, looking down, and Sarah understood the geometry of dominance as completely as she understood the geometry of a surgical suite. This was the moment that mattered. This was the moment when she either submitted or resisted, when she either knelt or fought back, when she either accepted the hierarchy he was establishing or rejected it outright. Sarah lowered herself to her knees. The tile was cold even through the fabric of her scrubs. She began gathering papers with methodical precision, her movements efficient and unhurried, her jaw set to neutral. Around her, the night shift workers shifted uncomfortably. One of them, the respiratory therapist named Marcus, made a movement toward helping, but Sarah caught his eye and shook her head almost imperceptibly. "No. Not necessary." Her eye said what her mouth couldn't, "This is not your fight." Whitfield stood watching her for exactly 12 seconds, long enough to cement the dominance, short enough that he could claim he'd offered assistance if asked. Then he turned away, his expensive shoes carrying him back out of the cafeteria, his movements relaxed and satisfied. Sarah continued gathering papers until every one had been collected, every drop of coffee had been wiped from the floor, until the space where her meal had been looked like nothing had happened at all. The night shift workers returned to their coffee and their phones and their small conversations, but the atmosphere had shifted. The hierarchy had been established. Sarah Chen was someone who could be knocked down without consequence. Sarah Chen was someone who would pick things up without complaint. Sarah Chen was exactly the kind of quiet, compliant staff member that Dr. Whitfield preferred. It was a perfect performance. It was also a complete lie. 23 minutes later, Sarah stood in the supply closet on the 3rd floor, surrounded by boxes of gauze and four supplies and all the small tools of medical maintenance. The fluorescent light above her head flickered with an irregular rhythm, casting her shadow across cardboard and plastic. Her hands were trembling. Not from fear. That would have been simpler to explain, easier to justify. The trembling was something else entirely, a vibration in the muscles that came from holding everything in place, from maintaining composure under pressure, from being trained for 12 years to accept dominance in front of an audience while your nervous system screamed for a response that your mind had committed to withholding. She reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out the object she checked on at least a dozen times each shift, a tarnished military challenge coin, maybe 2 inches across, its surface worn smooth by 12 years of anxious fingers. The metal was cold against her palm. On one side was an eagle facing right, wings spread, the insignia so weathered it was almost illegible. On the other side was a date, 2011, and below that, 3 words, Kandahar. Operation Nightingale. Sarah held the coin in her steady hands and let them tremble around it, just for this moment, just in this place where no one could see. This was the only space where the mask could slip, where the composure could fracture, where the woman she had been before Bagram and classified operations and government-ordered disappearance could briefly acknowledge the woman she had to be now. The coin had been given to her by a platoon chief in 2011 after an extraction that was never officially acknowledged by any military branch. It was the only physical proof that Operation Nightingale had ever existed. It was the only object that connected her to a past that the Pentagon had very thoroughly erased. She breathed. In. Out. In. Out. The trembling slowly stilled. Her hands grew steady again. The woman in the supply closet arranged her expression back into professional neutrality, pocketed the coin, and stepped back out into the fluorescent hum of the 3rd floor. By the time she reached the nurse's station, she had returned to being exactly what everyone expected, Sarah Chen, competent night shift nurse, quiet and compliant and absolutely invisible. She had no idea what was about to change everything. The trauma bay doors hissed open at 2:48 a.m., and everything Sarah had buried for 18 months came with them. A transport team wheeled in a stretcher, a man in his 60s, civilian clothes, but the kind of bearing that made nurses straighten their spines without thinking. Navy Admiral. The paperwork said routine cardiac catheterization. Should have been simple. Should have been nothing. A grizzled medic named Rodriguez was doing transport assist, his weathered face scanning the bay with the eyes of someone who'd seen combat medicine in places that didn't exist on maps. He watched Sarah move, really watched her, as she prepped the instrument tray with an efficiency that wasn't quite hospital standard. It was something else. Something precise. Something learned under mortar fire in Kandahar, where wasted motion meant wasted seconds, and wasted seconds meant Marines bleeding out in the back of a Humvee. Rodriguez's jaw tightened. His eyes tracked her hands. Dr. Morrison arrived at 2:51 a.m., and Sarah could read the signs before he scrubbed in. The tremor in his fingers. The way his eyes couldn't quite focus. Whitfield had assigned him a double shift yesterday, a punishment, really, a test of loyalty to the hierarchy. Exhaustion made surgeons sloppy. Exhaustion made them dangerous. Morrison's hands were steady enough as he began, catheter advancing through the Admiral's femoral artery, the monitor showing normal readings, oxygen saturation good. Sarah stood across the table, ready. Waiting. At 2:56 a.m., Morrison's hand jerked. Not much. Just a twitch. The catheter nicked the descending aorta, a catastrophic mistake that took maybe 3 millimeters of imprecision to create. Blood pressure dropped like a stone. The monitor's rhythm became frantic, irregular. Alarm screamed. Morrison froze. His face went the color of old plaster, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. The resident assisting looked to him for direction, but Morrison was somewhere else, locked in the paralysis that came from knowing he'd just killed someone on the operating table. The Admiral's heart flatlined. Sarah moved before the thought finished forming. Her body was already calling for the thoracotomy tray, her voice calm and absolute, not a question, not a suggestion. Tray. Now. The surgical tech snapped to, muscle memory responding to something in her tone that transcended the hierarchy. Rodriguez watched from the corner where he positioned himself, and his eyes widened as Sarah's hands took the scalpel from the tray. 3 incisions. Swift. Precise. No hesitation. No wasted movement. Incision 1 at the 5th intercostal space, Incision 2 lateral, Incision 3 opening the pericardium to expose the chest cavity and the Admiral's motionless heart. Blood. So much blood. But Sarah's hands moved through it like they were reading a map her fingers already knew. She found the aortic nick, applied direct pressure to the hemorrhage point, her face a mask of concentration. Morrison was watching, his hands uselessly at his sides, his career collapsing in real time on the operating table. Sarah's fingers moved to the Admiral's heart itself, and she began direct cardiac massage, compressions through the open chest, her hands working the muscle with a rhythm that didn't come from Seattle General's protocols or any American hospital training manual. This rhythm came from Kandahar. From keeping Marines alive when the convoy got ambushed and the helicopter was still 15 minutes out. From hands that had learned to feel a heartbeat through blood and shock and desperation, to coax it back to life with the kind of muscle memory that only came from doing it over and over in places where there was no backup plan, no code team, no time for anything except the person dying in front of you. Rodriguez's mouth formed a single word, barely audible, Nightingale. The Admiral's monitor stuttered. Irregular. Then caught. Then resumed, weak but present. A rhythm. Life. The heart responded to her hands like it recognized something in the pressure, in the tempo, in the absolute certainty radiating from her fingertips. Oxygen saturation climbed. 68, 72. 78, sinus rhythm. Sarah didn't acknowledge Rodriguez. Didn't acknowledge Morrison, who was now backing away from the table as if he could distance himself from what he'd done. She kept her hands exactly where they needed to be, her voice dropping into the controlled monotone of someone running a code, keep pushing epi. Prepare another unit of PRBC. I need that aortic patch ready. The surgical team snapped into motion around her. Not following Morrison's frozen panic. Following Sarah's absolute certainty. A nurse who moved like she'd run this exact code 100 times before. A nurse whose hands didn't shake. A nurse who didn't ask permission, didn't defer, didn't say maybe we should. A nurse who simply said do this and people did it because the authority in her voice was the kind that came from muscle memory deeper than rank or title or the name on a hospital badge. Rodriguez watched from his corner, his weathered face going through a series of expressions, recognition, realization, and finally something that looked like understanding. He'd seen hands like that before. In Kandahar, 2009. In a dusty forward operating base where a Navy medic named Nightingale had pulled 3 Marines back from the edge of death one night, and nobody ever got confirmation of what she really was because some people didn't exist on paper anymore. The Admiral's chest rose and fell with the ventilator. His pressure stabilized at 94/58. Still critical, but no longer terminal. Sarah's hands continued their work, precise and economical, while Morrison stood frozen at the periphery and tried to make himself invisible. By 3:04 a.m., the aortic nick was patched, the bleeding controlled, the Admiral's heart beating on its own with the assist of epinephrine and the sheer force of Sarah's hands refusing to let it stop. She stepped back from the table with the kind of calm that only came from having already survived worse. Straightened her blooded gloves. Looked directly at Morrison for the first time all code. Get out, she said quietly. You're done here. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in the flat, professional tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Morrison left. No one stopped him. No one spoke. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm, the heart monitor's steady beep, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like they'd been witness to something they weren't meant to understand. Rodriguez approached as Sarah was removing her gloves, and his voice came out low and controlled, "How long?" Sarah didn't look at him. Just kept working, kept moving. "I don't know what you mean." Kandahar. 2009, Sanjin Valley ambush. 3 Marines and Admiral Harrison. He let the names hang there. You pulled us all through that night. Sarah's hands paused for exactly 2 seconds. Then she finished stripping off the gloves and turned to face him, and there was something in her expression that made it clear this conversation had never happened, would never be acknowledged, didn't exist in any official capacity. I'm going on break, she said flatly. There's documentation in the file. Dr. Morrison performed the procedure. I assisted. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Understood. Some debts were never acknowledged. Some people never officially existed. Some nights in Kandahar happened to people who weren't supposed to be there, healing people who weren't supposed to survive, operating under orders that would never be confirmed because the whole mission had been scrubbed from records the moment the last helicopter lifted off. But Rodriguez remembered. And as Sarah walked out of Trauma Bay 3 at 3:11 a.m., still wearing the Admiral's blood like a second skin, Rodriguez understood something that nobody else in Seattle General would figure out for another 5 hours. The quiet night shift nurse in the corner had just become a legend walking around in hospital scrubs. And the real nightmare, the part that nobody predicted, was only just beginning. Dr. Whitfield stepped through the trauma bay doors like a man entering a room he owned, and for the first 3 seconds he simply stopped. Sarah Chen stood elbow-deep in the Admiral's open thoracic cavity, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had kept human hearts beating in conditions that had no names. Blood painted her scrubs crimson. Her face was absolute stillness. Her rhythm was perfect, compress, release, the kind of cadence that came from muscle memory deeper than any civilian training could reach. Morrison sat hyperventilating in a plastic chair against the wall, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his surgical mask twice. The resident who'd nicked the descending aorta was pale gray, useless. But Rodriguez, the transport medic, stood watching Sarah with the expression of a man who'd just seen a ghost walk out of Arlington Cemetery. His lips moved without sound. Nightingale. Whitfield's eyes narrowed. His jaw tightened. In that moment, he understood that something had shifted beneath his feet, something he couldn't control, couldn't predict, couldn't demolish with a smile and a memo. Sarah didn't acknowledge him. Her hands kept moving. The heart kept responding. O2 sat climbing, 78, 82, 87, 91. Step back, Ms. Chen. Now. Whitfield's voice carried the practiced authority of a man accustomed to obedience, but it cracked slightly at the edges. He was watching her work. He was watching her save the Admiral. And he was watching a night shift nurse execute a procedure that would have taken him 40 minutes to authorize, 30 minutes to scrub in 4, and probably 20 minutes to execute, assuming he could execute it at all. Sarah withdrew smoothly. Withdrew is what she did, not retreated, not surrendered. She simply let her hands fall away, let the surgical resident step into the space her competence had just occupied, and she moved toward the sink like a woman leaving a room she'd already cleared. Blood dripped from her forearms. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent and eternal. Whitfield was already pulling his phone from his pocket before she finished scrubbing her hands. He stepped into the hallway, moving past the glass partition, and his voice came through the speakers in Sarah's ears even though he was deliberately walking away from her. That was the message. I'm so confident in what I'm about to do that I want you to hear every word. The first call went to the Chief of Staff. Whitfield's tone had shifted, no more authority, now it was alarm. Controlled, surgical alarm. I have a serious incident to report. Ms. Chen, the night shift nurse, just performed an unauthorized thoracotomy on an Admiral without physician supervision. Yes, a thoracotomy. I was called to the scene after the fact and found her elbow deep in the patient with no attending present. I understand the implications completely. Yes, I'm documenting everything. The call lasted for minutes. Whitfield paced the hallway like a prosecutor building a case. The second call went to board member Garrison at 5:48 a.m. Gerald, I hate to call this early, but we have a liability issue that's about to become a legal issue. That immigrant nurse on night shift, the one I flagged last month, just exceeded her scope of practice in a catastrophic way. Performed a procedure she has no credentials for. On an Admiral, which means federal jurisdiction. I've already called the Chief of Staff, but you need to know this happened on our watch. Garrison's voice came back through the phone speaker, sharp and alert. Whitfield had woken him up, and Garrison didn't sound surprised, he sounded like he'd been expecting something like this. I want her out before shift change, Whitfield said. I'm calling the state board right now. By 5:53 a.m., the State Medical Licensing Board had received a formal complaint. Not a verbal concern. A formal complaint. Whitfield had documentation prepared. He must have drafted it while Sarah was in surgery, because the timestamps on the complaint were pristine, the language precise. He cited Statute 3 April, 67 regarding scope of practice violations, cited the Administrative Code for Nurse Practitioner Credential Requirements, cited Hospital Policy Section 4.8 regarding unauthorized procedures. It read like a man who'd been waiting for an excuse to deploy this particular weapon. The third board member call came at 5:59 a.m. Patricia, Whitfield here. I've just filed a formal complaint with the State Licensing Board. Our night shift nurse performed an unauthorized open-chest procedure this morning. I'm recommending immediate termination, and I wanted the board to hear it from me directly before legal sends the notice. Yes, immediate. She's a liability we can't afford. Patricia's voice was all business. I'll call legal. You get security ready. Rodriguez watched from the hallway, his transport medic's eyes tracking Whitfield's movements the way a sniper tracks a target. He'd recognized Sarah in that trauma bay, recognized her hands, recognized the technique, recognized something that shouldn't exist anymore. He pulled his phone out and made a call of his own, but his voice was too quiet for Whitfield to hear. Angel 6, he said into the phone. Nightingale is alive. She's working night shift at Seattle General in Philadelphia. You need to know this. The person on the other end of that call didn't speak. They just listened. And then the line went dead. Sarah finished scrubbing out at 6:04 a.m. She dried her hands with precise movements, each motion deliberate and controlled. No trembling. No hesitation. Her scrubs were so blood-soaked that the hospital's cleaning protocols would probably classify them as biohazard waste. She peeled them off and stuffed them into the dedicated container, the one marked for contaminated surgical materials, and she changed into fresh scrubs with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had suited up for operations with worse odds and higher stakes. Whitfield was waiting in the scrub room when she emerged. He held the door open with his hip, blocking her exit, his expression arranged into something that resembled concern but tasted like satisfaction. The morning light from the corridor windows cut across his face in geometric lines. You understand what you've just done, he said. Not a question. A statement. An indictment. You performed a procedure you're not qualified for, violated hospital protocol, exceeded your scope of practice, and potentially created massive liability for this institution. I've already called the Chief of Staff, the board members, and filed a formal complaint with the State Medical Licensing Board. Sarah met his eyes. Not with defiance. With stillness. Her jaw was tight, that was the only tell, the only indication that anything inside her was moving at all. The Admiral is alive, she said. Her voice had dropped half an octave. His heart is pumping. His oxygen saturation is 96%. You can charge me with protocol violations, but you can't charge me with letting him die while you were in meetings. Whitfield smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd already won. You think that matters? You think saving one Admiral overrides every regulation, every credential, every board standard? I've got Morrison ready to testify. I've got the resident who was present. I've got 3 board members who are already reviewing your file. Security is going to escort you out at shift change, that's in 56 minutes. You can pack your things, turn in your badge, and walk out of here. He stepped closer, and his voice dropped to something almost intimate. When the lawsuit comes, and it will come, you'll wish that Admiral was still on life support. Because the only thing that will save your license now is if he doesn't survive. A dead patient means no negligence case. A living patient who can sue means your career ends in court. Sarah didn't respond. She simply moved past him, her shoulder brushing his arm with the kind of contact that wasn't quite an accident. She knew something Whitfield didn't. She knew that the Admiral was going to survive. She knew it the same way she'd known how to perform a thoracotomy under combat fire in Bagram, the same way she'd known how to read blood pressure from a man's skin color and breathing pattern, the same way she knew that 18 months ago a JSOC extraction team had pulled her out of a Black Ops mission in Helmand Province and told her that officially, Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen no longer existed, that her fingerprints had been scrubbed from every database, her service record sealed with a classification stamp that made it a federal crime to acknowledge she'd ever worn a uniform. She had been ordered to disappear, to take a civilian job, to become invisible. The Navy had given her a new social security number, a new history, a new name on hiring paperwork. They'd given her instructions to never speak about what she'd done, to never contact her unit, to never surface. The price of extraction was erasure. And for 18 months, she had accepted that price. She had folded it into herself like scar tissue, painful, visible to anyone who knew what to look for, but ultimately just part of the healing process. She'd become a night shift nurse at Seattle General because the night shift was invisible, because nobody paid attention to the quiet woman drawing blood at 2 a.m., because a hospital at night was not so different from a forward operating base at dawn, both places where the real work happened when the people in power weren't watching. But she hadn't expected to be discovered. She hadn't expected the Admiral to code. She hadn't expected her hands to remember a technique she wasn't supposed to know, remembered in muscle and bone and the deep cellular knowledge of someone who'd kept 47 Marines alive through an ambush that had no business producing survivors. 47. That was a number she'd never told anyone. That was a number that lived in her sternum like shrapnel that couldn't be extracted. Now Whitfield was going to fire her, and he thought that was victory. He thought he'd eliminated a threat to his authority, removed a complication from his carefully managed hierarchy, solved a problem with paperwork and phone calls and the kind of institutional power that made reality bend to his will. What happened next didn't just silence the room. What happened next changed everything. Security arrived at 6:44 a.m., 14 minutes before shift change. Sarah had already packed her things, a single small box containing her scrub jacket, a faded unit patch she wasn't supposed to have sewn into the lining 3 years ago, and the tarnished military challenge coin that she'd kept in her pocket for so long that the metal had taken on the shape of her hand. The security guard was former Army, his bearing still military despite the uniform and the badge. He looked at Sarah. He looked at her hands. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but he didn't say anything. He simply walked her to her car in the parking garage, the fluorescent lights casting everything in shades of grey, and he didn't comment when she sat in the driver's seat without turning on the engine and just stared at the steering wheel like it contained answers she needed to decipher. Her phone buzzed at 11:33 a.m. A text from Rodriguez. "Turn on CNN. Now." The basement laundry room smelled like bleach and industrial steam, a metallic sting that carved into her sinuses. Sarah folded her scrubs with hospital corner precision, the kind of precision that came from 18 years of military barracks inspections, from a life that officially no longer existed. Bloodstains marked the sleeve of her top, the Admiral's blood, rust brown against white cotton. She didn't shake as she folded. Her hands moved like machines, muscle memory overriding everything else. Fold. Crease. Stack. The fabric still carried the faint ghost of antiseptic, that sharp chemical smell that had become the smell of her failure. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, a sound like machinery grinding teeth. 2 industrial washers churned in the corner, their motors vibrating through the concrete floor. Sarah sat on that floor after she finished, her back against a dryer that radiated warmth like a small sun, and pressed the tarnished challenge coin into her palm hard enough to leave an impression. The coin was from Bagram, 2019, given by a colonel whose name she wasn't allowed to remember for an action she wasn't allowed to discuss. 2 faces pressed into worn silver, an eagle on one side, coordinates on the other. Those coordinates meant something once. Now they meant nothing. 45 minutes passed in that basement. 45 minutes of sitting on concrete, watching water drip from a pipe overhead, listening to the industrial rhythm of machines that didn't care that Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had just been erased from another life. Her phone buzzed at 11:27 a.m. Then again. then 3 more times in succession. Text messages from people whose names she barely knew, nurses who worked the adjacent shifts, all asking the same question, "Are you watching the news?" She didn't move. Not immediately. Sarah had learned long ago that panic was a luxury, that the appropriate response to catastrophe was compartmentalization and patience. But something in those repeated buzzes, that frantic, urgent rhythm, told her that whatever was happening, whatever was being broadcast on the screens mounted in waiting rooms and lobbies, it involved her. The coin pressed against her palm one more time, a small prayer to nothing in particular, and then she stood and walked upstairs. The lobby of Seattle General was all marble and recessed lighting, designed to suggest competence and calm. CNN played on 3 mounted screens, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat the moment she saw her own face. Not the tired face of a night shift nurse. Not the diminished, acceptable version of herself she'd constructed piece by piece over 18 months. Her service photo, younger, in dress uniform, Master Chief Petty Officer chevrons crisp and unmistakable. The Chiron below read, decorated Navy medic missing since 2022 found working under real name in Philadelphia. The room seemed to tilt. Not dramatically. Not with the theatrical swoon of television. Simply tilted, the way a ship tilts when the keel shifts. Sarah's grip on her keys tightened until the metal bit into her palm, but her face remained composed, a mask of professional interest, the face of someone reading her own obituary and deciding it wasn't relevant. People around her were pointing. A woman in scrubs was saying something into her phone. Someone laughed nervously. Nobody yet understood what they were looking at. Then the elevator doors opened. The Admiral emerged first, moving with the careful deliberation of a man 3 days post-surgery, each step a small negotiation with pain. But his eyes were sharp and alert, and flanking him in a dress uniform so pristine it could cut glass was a Navy captain, his bars glinting under the fluorescent lights. Behind them came the hospital's chief medical officer, and then, impossibly, 2 figures in dark suits that Sarah recognized with the kind of sick clarity that comes from combat training. Federal agents. The captain's gaze swept across the lobby and locked directly on Sarah, and in that moment, in that single second of eye contact, everything she'd buried screamed to the surface. The captain stepped forward, his voice carrying in the marble space like a command echoing in a canyon. Nightingale. That name. Nobody had spoken that name in 18 months. Nobody alive was supposed to know it. Sarah's composure fractured just enough that her shoulders straightened, just enough that her breathing changed. The hospital security guard, a former Army sergeant named Martinez who'd never paid her more than passing attention, snapped to attention with the precision of muscle memory and announced loudly enough for the entire lobby to hear, "Master Chief Petty Officer on deck." Silence. Not metaphorical silence. Actual silence, the kind where you could hear the ventilation system hum, where the absence of conversation became a physical presence in the room. 50 people turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. A phone lowered slowly. Dr. Whitfield emerged from the elevator bay, his expression shifting from confusion to something that looked like the moment before an animal realizes it's been hunted, and that it's been hunted for a very long time. The Admiral pulled a tablet from the captain's hands with the careful deliberation of someone reading from a formal record. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to commanding the attention of rooms full of people far more dangerous than Philadelphia hospital staff. Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, United States Navy. 15 commendations including 2 Bronze Stars with Valor device. Navy Cross recommended, classified. Combat Medic, Joint Special Operations Command attached, 16 deployments across 3 continents. Sarah's jaw clenched. Not visibly. Just a tightening that someone trained would recognize. The Admiral continued, his eyes never leaving hers. Helmand Province, 2022. Our convoy hit an IED and small arms ambush in Sanjin Valley. Chen carried me and 3 others 6 kilometers through enemy fire to extraction. Took shrapnel that was meant for my head. He turned slightly, showed the room the scars visible at his collar where surgical bandages had been removed. They told me she died at Bagram 3 days after that extraction. I've been looking for her ghost for 18 months. The captain added in a quieter voice, her file was classified and buried under JSOC protocols. Officially, she doesn't exist. We don't know why. Then Rodriguez spoke from somewhere in the crowd, Rodriguez, the transport medic who'd whispered her call sign in Trauma Bay 3, who'd served in a different unit in Kandahar and knew exactly what he was witnessing. I served in Kandahar, different battalion. I've seen classified videos of her technique. Combat medics talk. She's legend. What she did with injuries that should have been fatal, she wrote new protocols for field medicine. The Admiral slowly lowered himself to one knee, and the captain followed immediately, his dress uniform pristine as he knelt on the marble floor. Martinez the guard dropped next, his security uniform creasing, and then a nurse with an army tattoo on her wrist, and then another person and another, spreading like dominoes through the lobby. 12 people eventually, kneeling in silence, and Sarah felt her composure splinter the way ice splinters under pressure. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes, which had remained dry through the humiliation, through the security escort, through the basement laundry room and the folding of her own erasure, finally gave way. Tears streamed down her face as she stood motionless in the center of the marble lobby, surrounded by strangers and the ghosts of people who'd been saved by hands that the military had tried very hard to forget. The Admiral looked up at her from his kneel, his expression carrying the weight of debts unpaid and survival costs that could never be properly calculated. The captain remained on one knee, his eye steady and certain. And in that moment, in the space between Sarah's old life and whatever came next, the coin in her pocket seemed to pulse with a weight that had nothing to do with silver and everything to do with the simple fact that she had been found. The captain remained on one knee, his eye steady and certain. The marble lobby held its breath. Then he spoke. Quietly. A single word that erased 5 years of burial, 5 years of erasure, 5 years of being nobody at all. Nightingale. Sarah's chest went still. Nobody had spoken that name aloud in her presence since the extraction order came down in Helmand. The code name belonged to a different woman, one who existed in redacted files and compartmentalized briefings, whose service record was filed under 3 different false identities, whose very survival depended on staying invisible. The army veteran at the security desk, a man with a Desert Storm tattoo fading on his forearm, snapped to rigid attention. His voice cut through the lobby with the precision of a parade ground command. Master Chief Petty Officer on deck. Heads turned. Visitors froze. A woman pushing a wheelchair stopped mid-step. The words hung in the air like the moment before a defibrillator delivers current, the instant between flatline and restoration. The Admiral rose slowly, deliberately, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body still carried the weight of survival. He held a tablet in his weathered hands, and his eyes, pale blue, the color of winter Atlantic water, found Sarah's across the lobby. He didn't smile. This wasn't a moment for smiling. His voice, when it came, was sandpaper and steel. 15 commendations, he began, reading from the screen. The lobby went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their electric prayer. Combat medic certification, advanced trauma protocols, direct action operations across 4 continents. He paused. The silence stretched like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. 2 bronze stars. Another pause. Sarah's hands were steady now. Military bearing taking over where civilian exhaustion had left off. Her spine straightened incrementally. Her breathing became intentional. The mask was lifting. She carried me, the Admiral continued, his voice roughening, and 3 others, 6 kilometers through enemy fire when our convoy was ambushed near Bagram. Taliban from 3 positions, our Humvee burning, our driver dead, our radio compromised. He looked at the tablet, but Sarah knew he wasn't reading anymore, he was remembering. She took shrapnel meant for me. 2 pieces the size of dice lodged between her ribs. She kept moving. Kept all of us alive for 6 kilometers of contact. Under fire. Bleeding out. Still cleared our perimeter at the extraction point. The Admiral raised his eyes from the tablet. And your hospital fired her this morning, he said to the assembled crowd, for exceeding her scope of practice. For saving my life. For doing exactly what she was trained to do. 10 seconds of absolute silence filled the marble lobby. Fluorescent lights buzzed. Rain hammered the windows outside. The second hand on the wall clock ticked with metronomic precision. Then the Admiral lowered himself to one knee. Not slowly. Not grandly. With the practiced deliberation of a man whose body had learned humility through blood and sand. His knee touched marble. His head remained level, his eyes never leaving Sarah's. The captain followed. A man whose uniform carried the weight of command, whose pairing had never bent, dropping to one knee on hospital tile in front of God and 36 witnesses. Then the security guard. Then Morrison, Sarah's replacement in trauma, stumbling forward and dropping like his legs had forgotten how to stand. Then a nurse from maternity who'd treated the Admiral in the surgical ICU. Then a surgeon from orthopedics who'd never spoken to Sarah in her life. Then a maintenance worker, a respiratory therapist, a clerk from medical records. 12 people in total. Kneeling. Sarah's hands trembled once, just once, before she locked the tremor down and buried it where the rest of her pain lived. The Admiral rose after 30 seconds and extended his hand. Sarah shook it. His grip was iron. His eyes were clear. "Welcome home, Master Chief," he said quietly, and the lobby erupted. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Whitfield. That happened 5 hours later. FBI agents arrived at Seattle General at 3 o'clock, badges visible, their movements carrying the particular gravity of federal authority. They didn't announce themselves to the lobby. An audit, they explained while Whitfield's face cycled through confusion to comprehension to panic, had flagged his personnel file for discrepancies. His termination of Sarah Chen contained contradictions. Documentation inconsistencies. Digital timestamps that didn't align. When the forensics team examined his computer, they found the deletions. They found the backdating. They found the evidence that he'd altered her employment records 3 hours after she was escorted from the building, attempting to create retroactive justification for terminating her before any medical board could review the Admiral's condition. Document forgery. Falsifying federal records, because the Admiral held a classified Pentagon briefing, making his medical care part of the federal record. Obstruction of justice. Conspiracy to cover up the circumstances of his hospitalization. "I'm going to need you to come with us," the senior agent said. She was a woman with iron-gray hair and a face that had seen every version of human rationalization. "We can do this here or at the field office. Your choice." Whitfield's lawyer arrived within 40 minutes, but by then the agents were already walking him out, his wrists bound with silver handcuffs that caught the fluorescent light like betrayal made visible. News cameras that had been stationed in the lobby for the Admiral's statement swiveled to capture his descent from the elevators. The hospital CEO made a statement. The board released a statement. The State Medical Board announced an emergency review. Morrison, Whitfield's protégé, the resident whose mistake had nearly killed the Admiral, was quietly transferred to a rural clinic in Montana. Whitfield's custom Italian shoes clicked on marble as he walked between the agents, past the nurse's station where he'd made his public bet about Sarah quitting within a week, past the cafeteria where he'd knocked her tray to the floor, past the security desk where the Army veteran stood with his shoulders back, watching. Sarah stood with the Admiral near the information desk, the challenge coin pressed against her palm like a talisman, and watched the man who'd tried to erase her get led away in handcuffs. His network of board members and favor brokers dissolved in real time. His allies released careful statements. His reputation, built over 12 years of institutional power, collapsed like a building with its foundation removed. The Admiral stood beside her in silence. He had no idea who he was fighting, the Admiral said finally. None of them did. No, Sarah agreed. Her voice had changed again, lower, steadier, belonging to the woman who'd walked 6 kilometers through fire. They didn't. 18 months later, Sarah worked openly at the Philadelphia VA hospital, her Master Chief rank restored, her file partially declassified, her service finally finally, acknowledged by something other than redacted documents and sealed testimony. The tarnished challenge coin lived in her locker, but now it had company. A photograph appeared in her locker one Tuesday afternoon, sent by a Seattle General nurse whose number Sarah had kept. It showed Dr. Whitfield sitting behind a folding table outside a strip mall in Bellevue, supplemental insurance policies stacked in front of him, his medical license permanently revoked, his name scrubbed from the hospital's website before his hands even touched the handcuffs. Sarah pinned the photograph next to the tarnished challenge coin. Then she reached into her coat and withdrew the second coin, the pristine one the Admiral had pressed into her palm the day he knelt, its surface still catching the light like captured water, like resurrection, like a debt acknowledged and remembered. She set it carefully on the metal shelf beside the first. "Reminders," she said aloud, her hand touching both coins simultaneously. One battered, one perfect. One from Bagram. One from Philadelphia. One proof that she'd survived. One proof that survival mattered. Rodriguez worked 2 floors down in physical therapy now, and they shared coffee on Wednesdays, trading stories they were finally allowed to tell. The captain had taken a position at Joint Base Lewis McCord, and his letters came sometimes, careful, brief, addressing her as Master Chief. The Admiral still called every 6 months on a secure line, never saying much, just checking that she was still breathing, still moving forward, still visible. The young corpsmen rotating through the VA's trauma training program learned from her how to translate combat medicine to civilian protocols, how to hide in plain sight when the world demanded invisibility, how to know when to surface and when to stay buried. One corpsman asked about the 2 challenge coins resting in her locker, curious about the symbols. Sarah touched the tarnished one first, Bagram, 2009, a weight that would never fully lift. Then the pristine one, Philadelphia, 5 hours after everything changed. She turned both over in her hands like she was reading Braille. Reminders, she said, the same words she'd spoken 18 months earlier to an empty locker. That the work matters more than the credit. And that the ones who have seen the worst often give the most. The corpsman nodded, understanding without understanding, the way young soldiers do when they're standing before someone who's already paid prices they're still too early in their journey to comprehend. Sarah returned to her shift, finally visible, finally home, the challenge coins resting in her locker like promises kept. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what they were facing, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to know that quiet strength isn't the same as silence. And tell us in the comments, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were catastrophically wrong?